Good evening, everyone. Peter Duveen here, back with another installment of civil defense. Civil defense being uh, the way in which, populations protect themselves from either a natural or artificial disaster, uh, how they sort of pick up the pieces after a disaster, or protect themselves um, in the event of a disaster, some kind of preparation, that sort of thing. This is civil defense, but we are focusing on a particular type of disaster, which would be a nuclear war. That is the exchange of nuclear bombs between nuclear armed countries. That would result in probably loss of life and great damage to people's homes, to their physical bodies, to their well-being in many different ways. Um, how do we protect ourselves in the aftermath of such an event if that were to happen? And because of recent events, such as the conflict in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, and uh, actually between the United States and Russia in the end. Um, the, uh, the possibility of a nuclear exchange that I just mentioned is uh, more likely. So what we've been doing in the past 30 or 40 days is trying to go over some material that will enlighten us as to what happens in a nuclear explosion, and then later on how we can protect ourselves from the worst of it, or how we can eventually pick up the pieces in the event that we survive it. Um, what we've been looking at recently is the effects of nuclear radiation, and we've left one effect to the end. It's all about genetics. The question is, what kind of genetic damage can an atomic explosion do to the population? Genetic means that this is damage that could be inherited by our descendants. So if we were almost all of us affected in one way or another, our descendants might inherit some kind of deformity or some other challenges, physical challenges, all sorts of things that our genes control if that damage is inherited by our descendants, if it affects our our genes. So I'm going to begin. I've been reading from a book called The Effects of the Atomic Bomb. It was written in 1950, only 5 years after the first atomic bombs were dropped on Japan by the United States. And so this sort of event was fresh in the minds of the people who wrote this book. This is a revised version published in 1950, published by the U.S. government in conjunction with Los Alamos National Laboratories, with all these events of the building of the atomic bomb and then its being dropped on Japan only 5 years later. So I guess quite a bit of information was found out from the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki blasts, and also from people who had been working around radiation, such as people working around X-rays, which were then used for medical purposes. I mean, at that time, used for medical purposes. And then there were cyclotrons and these sort of machines that were investigating atomic structures, and they used a lot of radiation. So there were people who were exposed to radiation for various reasons besides the atomic bomb, and all of these people were studied for the effects of radiation on them. And then, of course, there are a lot of animal studies that were being done as well. So now we're going to focus on the genetic effects of radiation. So this is an important section, and let's see how far we can get. I'm not going to spend all that much time because I don't want you guys to get bored in any way. The genetic effects of radiation. Radiation and genetic mutations. Because of the possible importance of the subject for the future of the human race, no discussion of radiation injury would be complete without consideration of the genetic effects. Whoever wrote this, had a great deal of insight, I think. Okay, let's continue. These effects differ from most other changes produced by radiation in that they appear to be cumulative and within limits, independent of the dosage rate of the energy of the radiation. The mechanism of heredity is essentially similar in all sexually reproducing plants and animals, including man. The material responsible for inheritance is organized into discrete structures, the chromosomes, which are visible microscopically in the nuclei of dividing cells. So at that time, they already knew that the chromosomes, structures in the cell, were the sites of heredity. The chromosomes are considered to be fine threads of nucleoprotein, which are differentiated along their length into thousands of distinctive but submicroscopic units, the genes. The development of inherited characteristics is controlled by the action of the genes. Chromosomes, and hence the genes, occur in pairs in the nuclei of the cells of individuals, one member of each pair being contributed by each parent through the sperm or egg. Just an aside, it's kind of interesting. I'm tutoring a high school science student who is now just now covering genetics in his studies. So this sort of thing, I sort of laugh because I've gone through some of the history, at least the current books emphasize some of the history, and we know that Watson and Crick were the ones who actually deciphered the the structure of the DNA molecule. I think it was in 1952. So it was just after this book was written. So it is interesting to try and get an idea of what they understood up until Watson and Crick announced their famous discovery. And obviously they knew something. They knew the chromosomes were composed of this, what do they call it? Thousands of distinctive but submicroscopic units, the genes. Yes, they knew at least that. The chromosomes are considered to be fine threads of nucleoprotein. So they knew that much, but there was something that they didn't know, and that's what Watson and Crick eventually discovered. Okay, mutations defined as changes in inherited characteristics may be classified roughly into two categories. Microscopically detectable changes in chromosome structure are called chromosomal mutations or aberrations. They may be responsible for visible changes in inherited characteristics, may cause reduced fertility, and frequently may be lethal, preventing the development of the embryos. The second category, gene mutations, includes those cases in which sudden changes in inherited characteristics are not the result of demonstrable changes in chromosome structure, but rather are believed to be due to changes in the chemical composition of the normal genes. The possibility remains, however, that many so-called gene mutations may actually be ultramicroscopic changes in chromosome structure. Mutated genes are commonly classified as dominant over normal genes, in which case an individual will show the particular characteristic if he receives the mutated gene from either parent, or recessive, in which case an individual must receive the mutated gene from both parents before exhibiting the characteristic. Mutations of genes in the sex chromosome are partial exceptions to this rule, since the male offspring receive sex-linked genes only from their female parent, and hence exhibit even recessive sex-linked genes. While most gene mutations appear to be recessive, recent evidence indicates that many so-called recessives are partially dominant. Gene mutations produce a wide spectrum of effects, ranging from visible changes with no apparent effects on viability and fertility to lethal mutations which kill the individuals in which they are expressed. Wow. However, almost all mutations are deleterious, and occurrence of beneficial mutations are very rare. The normal or spontaneous frequency of chromosomal aberrations and gene mutations is low. The rate of both can be increased by higher than normal temperatures, certain chemicals, and radiation. The same kinds and about the same relative frequencies of the various kinds of gene mutations are observed following radiation as occurs spontaneously. The frequency of radiation-induced genetic changes increases with increasing dose. So I'm going to just leave it at that tonight. Our next session we'll finish. I think we'll be able to finish in our next session. But summarizing, there are mutations that do occur due to radiation. They're mostly almost 100% deleterious, and some of them can be lethal even to the person who is still living, apparently. But of course, we're mainly concerned with any kind of genetic information that gets passed down. And as this gentleman said who wrote this book, because of the possible importance of the subject for the future of the human race, no discussion of radiation injury would be complete without consideration of the genetic defects. So we will finish this section tomorrow, and then we'll go on to something else. Thank you for coming tonight. This is Peter Devine signing off for Civil Defense.